As technology continues to impact and affect every area of our life, we cannot depend on vague generalities to make these ethical decisions. Our dignity and that of our neighbors is at stake. Take, for example, the first of the recent Google AI principles, what's deemed as be socially beneficial. This sounds like a laudable goal and something that we could all support. But if you take a really deep look at what they mean by that, it's incredibly ambiguous. What does it mean to be beneficial? What if my definition of beneficial is different than yours? Who is it going to benefit? The majority or the minority? Who decides? Who decides who decides? As you read these explanations, it becomes clear that there's a subtle form of utilitarianism actually framing this ethic. And I quote from that first principle. As we consider the potential development and uses of AI technologies, we have to take into account the broad range of social and economic factors. And we will proceed from there when we believe that the overall likely benefits substantially exceed the foreseeable risk and downsides. It's clear what Google is saying here is that they are going to pursue what brings about the most good, even though that good is often left undefined and vague. But as we all know, every person exhibits some type of bias or discrimination in the ways due to our sinfulness and our pride, and that can spill over into our ethics. And while Google has every right to pursue this course of action as they develop these powerful AI technologies, the public also has a right to push back on these vague utilitarian arguments and seek clarity about how these potentially life-altering technologies will be developed and used. And the Google AI principles are actually released on the heels of this infamous Project Maven project that they were working on with the military. They partnered with the United States Department of Defense to help develop an AI system that could help comb through countless hours of drone data, video data. The AI system was being trained to identify and automatically label targets and objects within the video data. Google actually pulled out of the project due to an uproar from their own employees who thought that Google shouldn't be involved in the weapons or tools of war, and that these technologies must be employed in a fair and socially beneficial way. The irony here is that this type of partnership between technology firms and the military actually allowed them their right to protest in a free society. But these protests raise many questions, though. What is the good? What is right? What is moral in these situations? How does fairness in this context line up with our safety of our brothers and sisters on the battlefield? What is fair and socially beneficial about terrorists or rogue nations having the advantage on the battlefield? Without clarity on the details of these ethical principles, it becomes increasingly difficult for our society to think wisely about the roles and the power of these technologies. As technology gets folded into nearly every aspect of our life, it's nearly impossible to avoid these conflicts between what is true and what we want to be true. What if the church had a better way forward, one that brought light to darkness and clarity to the murkiness of our ethical decisions? As Christians, our ethical decision making cannot be tied to the prevailing attitudes of certain elites or the in crowd or what's called the right side of history. At the most basic level, a Christian ethic is a transcendent or revealed morality. Not only did God create each of us in his image or in his likeness that we read about in Genesis, but he also spoke to us and he revealed to us how we are to live as his image bearers. Jesus Christ himself summed up the entirety of the Christian ethic in Matthew 22, verses 37 through 39, where he said that the greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second was to love your neighbor as yourself. To quote the esteemed theologian in Ephesus, Carl F.H. Henry, love for another is the whole sum of the Christian ethic. Henry goes on to say that God first loving us is a summary of Christian doctrine, and us loving him is the summary of Christian morality. Now, while this might seem simplistic, especially given the immense ethical challenges that we spoke about earlier, this simple yet profoundly robust ethic is more than capable of helping us to face some of the most complex and challenging questions being posed by artificial intelligence with a hope and a resolute faith in our God as our creator. Naturally, in Christian ethics, there's questions that are being raised about what does it mean to love God? And what does it mean to actually love our neighbor? Simply put, to love God is to follow his commandments. This is what we read about in 1 John 5:3. It means sacrificing our sinful desires and pursuits as we seek to love God more than we love ourselves, and to love those whom God loves as we obey his commandments and follow after him. It means for us to be who God created us to be, to live in the way in which he designed us to live, and to honor the dignity and value of every human being as a fellow image bearer of God. And by loving others and putting others before ourselves, we will take a very distinct view of ethics and technology, especially with AI, that can be so easily used to dehumanize our neighbors and treat them as simply a means to an end, or a means to self-preservation, power, and control. As we saw earlier about the rise of facial recognition, automation, even weapons of war, it's easier than ever to dehumanize or subjugate our neighbors as we, in a bit of irony, seek to humanize our own machines. In this age of AI, the Christian ethic calls us to live in a certain way that reflects the goodness of our Creator and our love for our neighbor. It reminds us that while we are still each individuals with an interior nature, this isn't to be exposed for everyone to see, even though we don't have a true sense of privacy before our God. Our God is all knowing, but he's also all loving. And that standard of all knowing and all loving is something that our fellow man often fails to live up to because of our sinful natures. The Christian ethic reminds us that while there is some kind of value in our contributions to society, our work does not define us as human beings. We're created to work in God's good design, even if our work might look different than expected in the light of artificial intelligence and the technologies of the future. A Christian ethic also helps to remind us that even though our enemies we seek justice in this world, we also bear the weight of responsibility because our enemies too are also created in God's image, and we must seek justice as we seek just war in our combat. And even as machines and AI might subtly shift how we go about seeking justice and peace, our role as image bearers and the call to love our neighbor does not change. So as we debate the dangers and the merits of emerging technologies like the cost of facial recognition systems, or how algorithmic biases disparage minorities, or how AI-based weapon systems are being deployed in our battlefield, we must remember that we're called to apply this robust Christian framework of ethics centered on the dignity of every human being to every single area of our decision making and our moral decision making. The Christian moral tradition is based on this concept of human exceptionalism, which runs contrary to many of the materialistic type of visions that are so prevalent in science and technology. And this is why we must keep human dignity at the core of our ethical framework. We're to claim that God, who are we to claim that God, the creator of the cosmos and the universe, who knit us together in our mother's womb, doesn't actually understand what is good for us and what ultimately will lead to his glory? We're called to love our neighbors, to stand up for their rights and the dignity in an incredibly complex world. As technology and influence increases in our society, we must be reminded that we have a steadfast hope and a robust ethic to engage the issues of the day from a place of hope and faith, rather than this debilitating pessimism or even this unbridled optimism. Christians have a steady hope in the midst of an uncertain future because we know that our God is above all sovereign over history, and that all of humanity, and that nothing will ever change or supplant the image of God that God has created us